Hey guys, tonight we step into the heavy velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace, the echoing halls where every footstep might feel like it's being measured against history itself, and you probably won't survive this, emotionally if not physically, because the sheer weight of crowns can be surprisingly crushing. You trudge past portraits that glare at you with the intensity of centuries, and outside, the Thames shimmers with the fog of early Victorian London, chimneys coughing up the thick breath of industry, and you can almost smell the coal dust mixing with the faint hint of royal gardens. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, comment your location and local time. It's a tiny detail that makes this massive empire feel just a little more personal. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are 18, and somehow, against all odds and the predictable whims of a sprawling royal lineage, Victoria becomes queen. You can almost feel her shoes, tight, too formal, clumsily stepping onto the stage of history. The young monarch inherits a kingdom brimming with contradictions, glittering balls and beggars, innovation and entrenched traditions. Historians still argue whether her youth gave her an advantage, a kind of naive energy, or if it was a recipe for early missteps, because ruling isn't just about wearing a crown, it's about navigating the undercurrents of ministers who are already a generation older, seasoned in the cold calculus of power. You wander through the corridors, imagining her alone in the early nights, quill in hand, writing letters that will travel across the empire, her handwriting a delicate tether connecting distant lands to the throne. Outside, London streets are alive with horse-drawn carriages and the first puffing steam engines, the air pungent with the smell of coal and bread ovens. Oddly, a fringe fascination is how Victoria reportedly had a soft spot for small animals, even keeping tiny lapdogs that accompanied her like miniature guardians of the monarchy, while simultaneously overseeing vast territories teeming with millions of people she would never meet personally. The coronation itself was a spectacle of pageantry and power. Gold, jewels, and velvet draped every surface. Yet beneath the pomp, you sense the pressure, the expectations of a population watching a teenager assume the weight of an empire. You feel that tension in your own chest, as if each echoing drumbeat in Westminster Abbey whispers, history is watching. And yes, she probably considered stepping off the dais, if only for a moment, to escape the absurdity of being forever observed, a living symbol of the nation, the empire, and the very notion of monarchy itself. You notice the subtle ways she navigates protocol, each curtsy and nod a coded message to her advisors, and historians still debate whether her meticulous attention to ceremony was genuine reverence or a strategic assertion of authority. You trudge past those gilded halls again in your mind, thinking of young Victoria learning to reconcile duty with personal desire, an eternal balancing act between public expectation and private life. You almost hear the distant rumble of horse hooves, a reminder that London never truly sleeps, just as the empire she's inherited will never truly rest under her gaze. You slip into the quieter corners of Windsor Castle, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and lingering candle wax, and suddenly, the tumult of the public crown feels a little more distant. Victoria's life begins to intertwine with Prince Albert, her cousin, her confidant, her partner in shaping not just a family but an image that will ripple across the empire. You watch them, in your mind's eye, negotiating marriage contracts like chess moves, aware that the personal is inseparable from the political in these gilded corridors. Historians still argue whether their relationship was primarily romantic or a strategic alliance, though, between the soft rustle of satin and whispered letters, it's hard to deny genuine affection. You trudge alongside Victoria as she navigates the strange intimacy of marital life under the scrutiny of the public eye. The domestic rituals are a curious mix of warmth and performance. Breakfasts in ornate dining rooms become stages for conversation, diplomacy, and subtle instruction. Albert's keen intellect complements Victoria's shrewd judgment, and together they carve a domestic sphere that's both cozy and emblematic of moral authority. You notice her obsession with order, schedules, etiquette, and the little household details that bind a family together while simultaneously reflecting the dignity of the crown. Oddly, she apparently insisted on personally overseeing the laundry for her children at one point, tiny glimpses of a monarch trying to preserve a sense of normalcy amidst the relentless pressures of public life. You watch her parenting, the juxtaposition of tenderness and discipline. Children are ushered in and out of lessons, guided through languages, music, and art, while also serving as miniature emissaries of the crown. You feel the almost suffocating weight of expectation, not just on Victoria, but on her offspring, who are being molded into future symbols of empire. Fringe accounts hint that she sometimes roamed the nursery corridors in a long, shadowed gown, silently observing the children like a general surveying a battlefield, a habit that inspired both loyalty and quiet dread. Her marriage profoundly affects public perception. Victoria's devotion to Albert is broadcast in portraits and prints, shaping her image as the ideal wife and mother, a moral anchor in a rapidly industrializing, socially turbulent Britain. You trudge through the layers of symbolism, the Queen's hand gently resting on Albert's, the children arrayed in perfectly symmetrical poses, each tableau reinforcing ideas of stability and continuity. Yet behind the smiles, there are letters, notes, and whispered advice that suggest a more complex negotiation of affection and authority. Historians still argue whether Albert wielded more influence than Victoria openly admitted, subtly steering policy while she maintained the visible visage of control. You can almost feel the quiet nights, the fires crackling, the faint scent of rosewater from the gardens drifting in, as Victoria pens letters to Albert or reflects on the strange marriage of power and intimacy that has become her life. You trudge alongside her through those moments, realizing that this royal household is not just a family but a carefully curated instrument of statecraft, where personal and political spheres are forever intertwined, and every domestic gesture is a brushstroke in the portrait of a global monarchy. The children sleep, the palace hums, and somewhere in the shadows, you sense the quiet pulse of an empire that rests, at least in part, on the delicate balance of love and duty within these walls. You step out into the streets of London, and the city itself feels alive, almost breathing beneath your feet. Smoke curls from factory chimneys, mixing with the scent of bread ovens and the occasional whiff of horse dung, a reminder that progress rarely comes without its chaos. You trudge along cobblestone streets where children dart between carts and puddles, while men and women labor long hours in textile mills and ironworks, their faces smudged with soot but their eyes reflecting determination. Historians still argue whether Victoria truly understood the social upheaval her empire's industrial heart was creating, or if she simply became a symbol of stability amid the relentless march of mechanization. You notice the rumble of new steam engines and the metallic clatter of the railways stretching across the country, connecting ports, mines, and cities like veins pumping energy into the nation. Industrial Britain is awakening in a way no monarch has witnessed before. Fringe tales speak of Victoria's fascination with railway timetables, how she would, on certain days, check the speed and efficiency of trains as though testing the heartbeat of her empire itself. You almost step onto a platform alongside her, feeling the thrill of steam and smoke, imagining the power of locomotives as both symbols of progress and instruments of empire. Factories tower above you, brick walls blackened by soot, while inside, the air is thick with heat and the rhythm of machines pounding tirelessly. You trudge past workshops where innovations in textiles, steel, and machinery are shaping the future, while laborers navigate strict hierarchies and long hours. Yet even as the Industrial Revolution fuels wealth and empire, shadows persist. Child labor, unsafe conditions, and social unrest stir quietly, a murmur beneath the loud fanfare of Victorian progress. Historians still debate how much influence the Queen exerted over social reform, balancing moral guidance with deference to elected ministers. Amid the clamor of industry, Victoria's public appearances reflect the transformation of society. You can picture her attending grand exhibitions, marveling at inventions and curiosities, her presence both endorsing innovation and providing a reassuring continuity. Oddly, she reportedly had a particular fascination with mechanical toys and automata, delighting in their miniature ingenuity as if they were tiny emblems of the industrial world she ruled. You trudge along the bustling exhibition halls, sensing how the Queen's personal interests subtly encouraged public enthusiasm for science, engineering, and arts. You wander into the countryside, too, where the contrast is stark, pastoral calm interrupted only by railway whistles in the distance. The duality of Britain, industrial heartbeat and serene landscape, mirrors Victoria's own balancing act between modernity and tradition. You feel the tension of a society straining to modernize while holding on to centuries of custom, and through it all, the Queen's figure looms large, a symbol both human and mythic. As you trudge along, you sense that every factory whistle, every puff of steam, every newly paved street corner is stitched into the tapestry of an empire that depends not just on conquest abroad, but on transformation at home, and on the quiet, vigilant gaze of a young queen who watches, records, and subtly guides it all. You lift your gaze from the soot-streaked streets and find yourself spanning continents, as if the empire itself stretches beneath your feet. India shimmers in the distance with its monsoon-laden skies, bustling bazaars, and palaces gilded in sunlit splendor. You trudge through the imagination of Britain's colonies, feeling the heat of deserts, the humidity of jungles, and the steady march of soldiers and administrators who carry the Queen's authority thousands of miles from London. Historians still argue whether the direct influence of Victoria over colonial policy was symbolic or actually practical, yet there is no doubt her image became the emblem that bound disparate territories into a single imperial identity. You wander the streets of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, sensing the blend of local tradition and foreign oversight. Telegraph lines and steamships shrink the world, carrying letters and decrees across oceans, often reaching distant governors before the ink on her personal notes has dried. Fringe stories speak of how Victoria was fascinated by Indian jewelry and textiles, commissioning intricate pieces while simultaneously presiding over an empire where millions lived in stark poverty, a tension that seems almost impossible to reconcile, yet is a constant undercurrent of her reign. You feel the paradox of opulence and hardship, of ceremonial durbars where princes bow and merchants trade, while famine and resistance simmer quietly in the background. Africa, too, stretches before you, savannas, deserts, and rivers coursing like veins across the land. You trudge along alongside British explorers and traders, whose maps bear her signature as a distant yet omnipresent authority. Victoria's face appears on coins, stamps, and medals, a visual tether linking colonists and native rulers alike to the distant throne. You can almost hear the whispers of debate in Parliament, as officials weigh the costs of expansion against the moral and logistical challenges, and historians still argue whether the Queen herself ever fully grasped the complexities of ruling such a vast and diverse empire. In Canada and Australia, the Queen's presence is equally symbolic, though the landscapes are wildly different: towering mountains, endless plains, and remote settlements barely touched by the reach of London. You trudge through the imagination of these colonies, feeling both the pride of imperial ambition and the quiet disquiet of indigenous populations watching foreign authority settle over their lands. Victoria's portraits adorn halls, schools, and post offices, her image a constant reminder of loyalty, while fringe anecdotes suggest she had personal correspondence with colonial children, offering encouragement and gifts that bridged oceans in a way only a monarch could. As you traverse these lands, you sense the duality of empire, glory and grievance, ceremony and coercion, pride and profound ethical tension. You realize that Victoria's shadow stretches further than most empires could hope, touching distant lives in ways both intimate and abstract. Every stamp, every statue, every imperial gesture threads her presence across continents, while back in London, the monarchy stands as both observer and orchestrator, a beacon of unity in a world connected by steam, wire, and the enduring influence of a single queen whose reign is at once personal and global. You return to the echoing halls of Buckingham Palace, but this time the air feels heavier with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Court intrigue pulses quietly beneath the glittering chandeliers. You trudge past ministers whose smiles are polished but whose eyes flicker with calculation, sensing every movement of the young queen as if she were a chessboard on which their ambitions play out. Historians still argue whether Victoria's political instincts were naturally sharp or honed purely through necessity, Yet there is no denying that she learned to wield influence with a quiet, deliberate precision. You observe the delicate dance between Victoria and her prime ministers, Peel, Melbourne, Russell, each visit a negotiation of power. The Queen's opinions, sometimes forcefully expressed, subtly shift policy directions, even as the ministers maintain the facade of authority. Oddly, fringe anecdotes recount Victoria secretly taking notes on her cabinet meetings, cataloging opinions and alliances with the meticulousness of a schoolgirl noting her lessons, yet these tiny details often became crucial tools of statecraft. You trudge down the corridors imagining the soft rustle of her skirts as she moves between rooms, a silent observer whose gaze can determine political fortunes. Royal advisors, courtiers, and family members all play their parts in this theater of influence. You sense the tension in conversations where loyalty clashes with ambition, and every compliment or critique carries weight far beyond mere etiquette. Victoria learns quickly how to maintain appearances while quietly guiding ministers toward decisions she favors, mastering what historians still debate as a blend of intuition, manipulation, and ceremonial authority. You trudge past gilt mirrors and heavy curtains, imagining the reflection of a queen both patient and formidable, aware that a single nod or frown can echo across the halls of governance. Oddly, the Queen's love for writing letters also intersects with politics. She communicates directly with colonial governors, foreign dignitaries, and even the occasional prime minister in a way that blurs personal and official spheres. You notice the interplay of her private correspondence and public persona, each reinforcing the other, each cementing her image as both approachable yet unassailable. Fringe accounts mention her fondness for secret codes and letters to Albert or her ministers, a playful method that masks serious political intent. You trudge further through the palace's political landscape, sensing the subtle power of ceremonial gestures. The placement of chairs, the order of entrances, the carefully timed applause. Every ritual, however minor it seems, reinforces authority. Historians still argue how much these rituals genuinely affected policy outcomes, yet their impact on perception is undeniable. You almost feel the weight of unseen eyes on your own shoulders, the way public and private influence intertwine, and understand that Victoria's genius lies not just in ruling, but in mastering the art of perception, letting the empire see the queen they want while quietly shaping the one they need. You wander through the galleries and theaters that Victoria favors, the scent of oil paint and polished wood mingling with the faint aroma of roses from the palace gardens. Art, architecture, and music form a quiet empire of their own, and you trudge along these corridors feeling the pulse of cultural power that radiates from the Queen. Her patronage is deliberate, supporting painters, commissioning sculptures, and endorsing architecture that reflects stability, order, and the moral values of the era. Historians still argue whether her tastes genuinely shaped British culture or simply reinforced the prevailing trends, but the effect is undeniable. You notice her fascination with the Gothic revival, the ornate spires, and pointed arches that echo the moral certainties of the past, yet somehow, through them, the present is celebrated. Oddly, fringe tales suggest she even had a hand in choosing the fabrics for royal stage curtains and theater upholstery, believing that subtle aesthetics influence public perception, a detail that seems almost absurd, yet speaks to her meticulous attention to symbolism. You trudge through her influence like a quiet current, pulling artists, architects, and performers toward a vision that balances grandeur with accessibility, spectacle with moral didacticism. The public rituals she attends further reinforce her image. Processions, garden parties, and state openings of Parliament are more than ceremonial. They are a carefully choreographed narrative of continuity, reinforcing the monarchy's role as both guardian and moral compass. You can almost hear the rustle of silk and the tap of boots against marble as Victoria glides through the crowd, every gesture measured, every glance calculated. Fringe reports even suggest she enjoyed small theatrical performances staged for her amusement, where she would critique costumes and acting with the same seriousness she reserved for ministers and colonial governors. You trudge through the Queen's engagement with literature and science. She supports exploration, advances in engineering, and scholarly work, often granting royal patronage to scientists and academics who were shaping the modern world. Historians still debate the depth of her personal interest versus the political optics, yet letters reveal her keen curiosity. Questions about botanical experiments, steam engines, or the latest archaeological finds, connecting her mind across continents and disciplines. You feel the subtle thrill of discovery, as though Victoria herself is guiding a cultural and intellectual empire as vast as the territories under her political rule. You pause, imagining her reading rooms lined with books, maps, and curiosities from around the globe, a personal museum reflecting the vastness of her influence. Tracing your fingers over imagined surfaces, you sense the invisible threads linking art, ceremony, and intellect, weaving a portrait of a queen whose cultural patronage is as much about shaping perception as it is about personal taste. Every brushstroke she commissions, every concert she attends, every new building she approves becomes another node in a network of soft power, reinforcing her presence in the minds of subjects far beyond the palace walls. And you trudge on, feeling the subtle power of culture, where every song, painting, and procession resonates with the echo of her shadow over an empire both material and imagined. You step into the darker corners of the monarchy, the whispered hallways where scandals lurk behind polished doors and the flicker of candlelight reveals more than just opulence. You trudge past the echoes of rumors, feeling the invisible pressure of public expectation pressing down like a velvet-clad weight. Historians still argue whether Victoria's reputation for moral rectitude was genuine or meticulously curated to counter the undercurrents of intrigue, yet the shadows are undeniably there, stretching across court and country alike. Whispers follow you as you imagine affairs, secret correspondences, and the occasional indiscretion that threatens to pierce the polished veneer. Oddly, fringe accounts suggest Victoria was amused by the gossip itself, keeping a mental ledger of who said what about whom, using the knowledge to subtly assert influence. You trudge past ministers and courtiers, aware that behind every bow or curtsy, 1,000 calculations unfold, and even the smallest faux pas could ripple into larger consequences for those daring enough to challenge the Queen's authority. Public perception matters. The morality of the monarch is a mirror for the morality of the nation, and Victoria understands this with a precision that borders on cunning. You walk through the imagined press offices, the whispering correspondence, the letters sent to Parliament questioning loyalty, behavior, or conduct. Fringe stories hint at her occasionally staging minor scandals to distract from more serious political issues, a tactic that would make modern PR experts nod in admiration. Historians still debate how much of this was intentional and how much simply arose from the unavoidable complexity of living life under constant scrutiny. Yet the Queen's personal grief also intersects with public scandal. The early deaths of close family members, combined with tensions at court, create a realm where sorrow and rumor intermingle. You trudge through the heavy drapery of mourning, imagining Victoria cloaked not just in black fabric but in the societal expectations of an entire empire. Oddly, despite, or perhaps because of, this weight, she develops a certain sharpness, a capacity to read intent and motive in glances, gestures, and subtle inflections, skills that historians still cite as crucial in her navigation of both domestic and international affairs. As you linger, you notice the tension between appearances and reality. The Queen's public face of composure masks a private life rich in complexity, contradictions, and, at times, quiet rebellion against the confines of tradition. Every rumor, every scandal, every whispered accusation is another thread in the intricate tapestry of the monarchy, and you trudge along the edges, sensing the delicate balancing act she maintains. It's a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are not immune to human vulnerability, and that the shadow behind the crown can be just as compelling, if not more, than the glittering front that the world sees. You trudge back into the private quarters, where the presence of Prince Albert is almost palpable even in his absence. The corridors feel different now, warmer, yet lined with the weight of expectation and grief. Albert's influence is everywhere, from educational reforms to industrial exhibitions, shaping both policy and the Queen's personal worldview. Historians still argue whether his impact was decisive or more of a guiding hand behind the scenes, but there's no doubt that Victoria's reign, as it matured, became inseparable from his vision. You imagine Albert walking beside her, pointing out the latest scientific innovations or discussing the complexities of constitutional matters. Their partnership blends affection and strategy, a rare convergence in a court usually dominated by hierarchy and formalities. Oddly, fringe accounts mention Albert's obsession with household organization, from laundry schedules to precise instruction manuals for the royal kitchens, which Victoria absorbed with a mix of exasperation and admiration. You trudge through these domestic corridors, sensing how private order translates into public authority and how the couple's collaboration extends beyond marriage into governance and cultural stewardship. Albert's early death hits like a tidal wave, leaving Victoria isolated in a palace that suddenly feels cavernous. Mourning becomes ritualized, black crepe drapes, limited public appearances, and a withdrawal that shapes her image for decades. You trudge beside her as she navigates this grief, aware of how personal loss transforms into political posture. Historians still debate whether her extended mourning was an expression of genuine emotion or a careful cultivation of moral authority, yet the effect on the monarchy and public perception is undeniable. Letters between Victoria and Albert reveal layers of intimacy, counsel, and influence that go beyond romantic attachment. You trudge through the imagined stacks of these correspondences, feeling the echoes of advice, dissent, and encouragement that Albert provided, often steering policy, education, and the royal household with subtlety. Fringe tales recount that Victoria continued to consult his writings years after his death, treating them almost as a spectral presence guiding her decisions, a haunting yet stabilizing force. You sense the long-term consequences, the Queen's deepened conservatism, her intensified commitment to duty, and her meticulous oversight of public image. You trudge past mourning portraits and letters of condolence, realizing that Albert's shadow shapes not just her private world but the empire itself, from educational reforms in India to industrial exhibitions in London. Through this partnership and loss, Victoria's reign becomes a delicate weave of personal devotion, political acumen, and cultural stewardship, a blend that ensures the empire moves forward under the watchful eyes of a queen profoundly shaped by the man she called her consort. You trudge into the turbulent territories of an empire under pressure, where banners flutter amid unrest and distant drums echo the complexities of control. Wars, rebellions, and political upheavals ripple across continents, reminding you that imperial power is never absolute. India seethes with occasional uprisings, Africa simmers with resistance, and even the British Isles experience social and labor unrest. Historians still argue whether Victoria's responses were more symbolic than practical, yet her shadow looms over every action and reaction of the colonial administrations. You navigate through the chaos of military campaigns and civil disturbances, sensing the tension between loyalty to the crown and the growing discontent among subjects. Oddly, fringe anecdotes suggest Victoria occasionally received coded intelligence reports that she read with a curious mix of fascination and concern, as if the pulse of rebellion were something to be measured like the speed of a steam engine. You trudge along alongside generals and governors, feeling the enormity of balancing conquest and diplomacy, coercion and conciliation, and the delicate art of maintaining authority without crushing the very people whose allegiance she requires. Back in Britain, political pressure mounts as social reformers, industrial laborers, and emerging political parties challenge the status quo. You can almost feel the tension in the parliamentary chambers, the shuffling of papers, the quiet yet persistent debates over reform bills, suffrage, and welfare. Historians still debate how directly the Queen influenced policy, but the cultural weight of her approval or disapproval carries immense sway. Fringe reports hint that Victoria sometimes used ceremonial presence, royal visits, speeches, and public addresses as subtle signals to both encourage reform and reassure loyalists, an intricate dance of perception and influence. You trudge through distant colonial courts, observing the delicate negotiations with local rulers who must balance submission to the crown with the practical needs of their people. Letters, gifts, and formal recognitions serve as tools of diplomacy, and every decision echoes back to Victoria's image, reinforcing her omnipresence even when oceans separate her from the action. Oddly, she maintained a keen personal interest in technological and administrative innovations that could improve governance, From irrigation systems in India to telegraph networks in Africa, blending personal curiosity with imperial necessity. Through these pressures, you sense the paradox of empire. Power comes not just from armies or bureaucracies, but from perception, legitimacy, and the careful management of unrest. You trudge alongside Victoria as she navigates this complex web, feeling her presence as both stabilizing and commanding, a reminder that the empire's endurance relies on a combination of public awe, private diligence, and symbolic authority. Every rebellion quelled, every negotiation brokered, every speech delivered reinforces the image of a queen who, despite distance and challenges, remains the central axis around which the world in her shadow revolves. You trudge through the later years of Victoria's reign, where time has stretched the palace corridors and softened the edges of youthful energy into measured authority. Her hair is now streaked with gray, her posture still regal but tempered by decades of rule, and you can almost feel the quiet reflection that accompanies experience. Interactions with a new generation of rulers, both at home and abroad, are a delicate negotiation of respect, mentorship, and subtle influence. Historians still argue whether her later involvement in political matters was more symbolic than substantive, but her presence undeniably shapes diplomatic and domestic atmospheres alike. You wander past the grand drawing rooms where she receives prime ministers, ambassadors, and visiting monarchs. Every handshake, every measured nod, is part of a choreography honed over decades. Fringe stories suggest she occasionally tested new protocols herself, experimenting with small ceremonial changes to gauge reactions, tiny ripples in the vast pond of statecraft that could have unforeseen consequences. You trudge along the palace corridors imagining the weight of accumulated memory, letters archived, portraits commissioned, events remembered, and moments of personal triumph and sorrow layered upon each other like sedimentary strata of experience. Her empire has changed. Nations she once ruled indirectly are now asserting more autonomy, colonies are developing local governance, and the global landscape shifts with technological and political developments. You sense her reflection on the contradictions of her reign, the pride in modernization and expansion, the anxiety over rebellion and reform, the tension between ceremonial authority and actual power. Oddly, fringe accounts note her fascination with new inventions even in old age, telegraphs, electric lights, and early photography, reminding herself, perhaps, that the world continues to evolve under her watchful gaze. You trudge alongside the Queen as she recalls personal losses and triumphs, moments of joy with her family interspersed with political setbacks. Her letters reveal the blending of private emotion with public responsibility, a constant balancing act that few outsiders can comprehend. Historians still debate how introspective or strategic she truly was in these later years, but it is clear that her influence endures, both in policy and in the imagination of the British people. Finally, you feel the subtle shift as she mentors the younger generation, her son, Edward, future kings, and emerging leaders. Lessons are passed quietly, advice interwoven with anecdotes, and even the smallest gesture, a raised eyebrow, a pointed story, carries the weight of decades of governance. You trudge through the corridors of time alongside her, sensing the culmination of an era where experience, legacy, and the haunting shadow of past decisions converge, leaving a complex, layered impression of a queen whose reign has shaped not only a nation but the very world that grew under her careful, persistent gaze. You trudge through the hushed rooms of Buckingham Palace one final time, feeling the weight of history settle like dust on the gilded surfaces. Victoria's health has waned, her once steady presence now fragile, yet the aura of authority remains undiminished. You imagine her in her final days, surrounded by family and portraits of ancestors, each image a silent witness to the life she has lived. Historians still argue whether her prolonged reign strengthened the monarchy's symbolic power more than it constrained political flexibility, but there is no question that her shadow is cast wide across the world she once surveyed. You notice the quiet rituals marking the end of her life, the soft exchange of letters, the attendance of close advisors, the ceremonial protocols that have been practiced for decades now taking on an almost sacred resonance. Oddly, fringe accounts suggest that even in her final weeks, Victoria maintained interest in the affairs of her empire, reading dispatches and letters with a concentration that belied her frailty. You trudge past these details, feeling the paradox of a ruler whose physical presence diminishes but whose influence stretches across oceans, through colonies, parliaments, and hearts of her subjects. Her death, in 1901, closes an era. Edward ascends the throne, and Britain enters the Edwardian Age, a world technologically and socially distinct from the one Victoria first inherited. You trudge through the ceremonial mourning that grips the nation, black crepe draping streets, silent processions, and an outpouring of grief that mixes genuine affection with reverence for stability and continuity. Historians still debate how much the public loved the Queen herself versus the idea of her as the enduring symbol of empire, yet the sentiment is palpable, stretching from London to the furthest reaches of her former territories. You wander through the echoes of her legacy, statues erected, coins minted, stamps printed with her image, institutions named in her honor, social reform she inspired or guided, and the intricate tapestry of personal influence that shaped policy, culture, and public perception. Fringe stories hint at curious details, like her fascination with animals or her penchant for tiny curiosities collected from around the world, reminders of a deeply personal engagement with an empire that is often reduced to maps and dates. You trudge through these memories, sensing how the tangible and symbolic merge, forming the enduring shadow that gives this narrative its title. As you step back, you feel the quiet hum of transition. The world continues, empires rise and fall, and yet the imprint of Victoria's reign lingers, in architecture, governance, culture, and collective memory. You trudge one last time through the corridors of time, reflecting on a life that intertwined personal devotion, political acumen, cultural stewardship, and an unwavering presence that shaped a century. The era ends, but the echo of her influence continues to whisper across the lands she once ruled, leaving you with the haunting, persistent awareness that some shadows, though cast by a single life, stretch far beyond the horizon of that life itself. You slow your pace, letting the heavy velvet of history settle softly around you, and feel the echo of Victoria's world gradually dissolve into quiet. The vast corridors, the sprawling empire, the chatter of ministers, the distant rumble of rebellions, all fade into a gentle hush, leaving only the subtle warmth of legacy and memory. You trudge through these echoes as if walking along a calm riverbank at dusk, where the water reflects muted shades of gold and gray, and the air carries the faint scent of gardens long past, a whisper of life continuing beyond the sweep of crowns and ceremonies. The pulse of the empire, once thunderous with railways, factories, and distant colonies, slows to a gentle rhythm. You feel the weight of responsibility lift slightly, leaving space for reflection on the paradoxes that define Victoria's reign: duty entwined with affection, public symbolism balanced against private grief, tradition held alongside relentless modernization. Oddly, in these quiet moments, you imagine the tiny details: the lapdogs padding softly across polished floors, the flutter of letters arriving from far-flung corners of the world, or the flicker of candlelight in an otherwise silent study, reminding you that the human thread runs through the grand tapestry of history. You trudge along the fading corridors of memory, tracing patterns of influence that stretch from London to the farthest reaches of the empire, noticing how culture, politics, family, and personal devotion intertwine. Historians may still debate motivations and consequences, but you feel the undeniable truth. A life lived with both intensity and persistence leaves traces that ripple long after the footsteps cease. You let the imagery soften, the edges blur, the shadows of the past settle gently, carrying you toward a calm, reflective stillness. Finally, your mind drifts, unhurried, along the quiet streets, distant colonies, and sunlit gardens you've traversed tonight. The story becomes a gentle hum in the background, a lullaby of history whispering through time, easing you into a space where imagination and reflection blend seamlessly. You feel the comfort of continuity, the reassurance of enduring impact, and the soft, almost imperceptible presence of a world shaped and watched over by a queen whose shadow, vast and persistent, lingers quietly, a gentle guide as your own thoughts settle into rest.